My name is Gianfranco Papa, and I am CTO and co-founder at Sumia Software. And today at Flutter Tips, we are going to talk about how to choose your library in Flutter. Nowadays, in the pub.dev ecosystem that has grown quite a lot, it might be really difficult to select what library to use, and there might be like a lot of criteria to under that decision. So now we are going to see what are the caveats that might happen when selecting a library. One of them. So basically, one thing that can happen is that we have lack of maintenance and updates for that library. So in that sense, we have to select the libraries that uh, tend to have like more maintenance over time, so we can catch with the latest features of the language. Then we can be really extremely attached to the library, and that will result on the lack of flexibility that we have. So what we can do is try to basically select libraries that focus on one specific thing or task, instead of libraries that try to cover everything. And yet another thing that might happen is that we don't have full support for every platform. So a good practice is to try to identify which platforms the library support, and if it doesn't support the platform that we need at that moment, yeah, try to find another one, or maybe we don't know that we will be needing that platform at that time. So basically, we have to see the roadmap and identify if the library is going to provide full support on that platform in the future. And lastly, one thing that can happen is that the library might be really complex for us. And in that sense, what we can do is try to identify which is the complexity versus the simplicity of integrating that library and try to evaluate more alternatives. So these are one of the caveats that might happen when we already select a library. So now we are going to talk about some tips on how to prevent these issues earlier in the process. All right, so we have to really pay attention to all of the information of the library in the pub.dev page. So in here, what we can do is check for version history. This is really useful because it will tell us how the regular updates are of the library. So in here, we can see that this library was updated 6 months ago. So that is a reasonable amount of time. Then another thing we can check on top is the supported platforms. And this is really useful because it will tell us the platforms that support. And yeah, even though we are not, because in Flutter we can target different platforms, but even though if in the early beginning of the process we are not targeting that specific platform, it is a good idea to identify if that library will already support that platform in the future or not. And another thing that we can do is try to see the scope or need that this is trying to cover, that the library is trying to cover. And in that sense, we can like see the README file, understand what the library purpose is, and try to see if that will fit our needs. All right, so other things that we can see in the libraries or packages or plugins, right? We are talking always about these kind of things, will be the popularity and the documentation. Basically, we can measure the popularity by the number of likes, the pub points, or even the popularity score in the pub dev. Or also, we can go to the GitHub page and see how many stars it has, or the number of forks. That will tell us more or less the popularity of the library. Also, something really important is see if the library provides a good documentation, because otherwise it will be really difficult to kind of understand the library and try to start using the use cases that is providing us. So we can see the documentation in the README file, or maybe there is a custom page that they provide us. So yeah, it's really something a good practice to have everything documented. So it's really easy for us to integrate that. So you may wonder now, like how many libraries are right, now that we see everything. So I think like there is no the perfect number. We should minimize the number of dependencies in our project. So what I'm trying to suggest here is a reasonable amount between 20 and 30, because it makes sense to like use libraries and take advantage of all the problems that libraries already solve. but we have to like evaluate also what would be the best decision in terms of the short and the long run, right? Maybe it makes sense to integrate a library in the short term, but then in the long term it doesn't make sense because it doesn't provide us a lot of flexibility. So the thing here is that we have to practically measure the number of libraries that we have in our project to keep it more or less controlled over time. Finally, we're going to talk about when to choose a library, right? These are common scenarios that might happen to you. So one of the scenarios will be when we are facing a common problem that community already solved. For example, state management, right? This is something that we already have a lot of alternatives and solutions out there. So it doesn't make sense to write everything from scratch because we won't be speeding up our development process. So in that sense, we can choose one library that solves the state management problem and yeah, try to stick with that one. Another scenario that might happen is that we don't have the resources to make everything from scratch. So that's when libraries, I think, shine because it will help us to build something that even ourselves we can do it. So one example could be the Firebase libraries. Imagine if we are using Flutter in combination with Firebase, it would be really useful to integrate the Firebase libraries to our Flutter project. So last but not least, we have when we are running for a tight deadline or making an MVP. So basically here I put as an example the UI libraries because I feel like maybe they can speed up certain things and we can accomplish or meet our deadlines with those UI libraries. This doesn't mean that in the long run we have to keep those libraries. Maybe we can remove it and start doing everything from scratch because we will be having more control or flexibility. Or ideally, we can increase or try to improve that library and hopefully continue improving that library so it match our use cases. So with that being said, I wanted to thank you and yeah, let us know in the comments if you already knew that and if this was useful for you. And see you in the next Flutter tips.